All right, so there it is. We are live streaming. We are live streaming. I'm waiting on my picture to pop up, and I got the recorder on, and here it is. All right, so this is gonna be a little bit of recap right here. I got my little notes with me. I got some tea. I got some ginger beer too, non-alcoholic. And the name of this stream right here is an NAAA commentary on 12-step recovery, understanding trauma. And it's a perspective from Suni Sami, and I am Suni Sami. And so I'm going to go ahead and just jump into this thing. I got my notes. And I did a video the other day, and it was called 12-step recovery. And I talked about trauma. And one of the reasons why I'm starting to put a little focus on trauma is that when recovery is talked about, um, there are certain things that or addiction, to understand addiction and recovery, one must understand trauma. A person, excuse me, or an individual just don't enter into uh, recovery, right? They just don't, or excuse me, or addiction. They just don't wake up and just like be in addiction, like drinking or overeating or having promiscuous sex or using drugs, or they never establish a quality of life, or their quality of life goes down as a result of gambling, drugs, alcohol, promiscuous sex, um, workaholics. It's something that happens, and that's something that I'm gonna talk about again. It's called trauma. You know, when a person goes into an addictive state, um, and they get to the point where they rely on drugs and alcohol, what has basically happened? They have experienced some type of a trauma. And what is trauma? First of all, what is trauma? And there's three levels of trauma. And the first level is acute trauma. And acute trauma is where an individual experiences one incident in their life, no matter what age. They could be, 1 years old, or they could be 101 years old. But they can experience one. They can have one experience in their life that will traumatize them. And so, what is trauma? Trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing event. It's a deeply distressing or disturbing event that occurs in that individual's life. And it affects them on the four areas of their life: mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. So they can experience what is called acute trauma, and that's the first level of trauma. And then the next level is chronic, or they can experience some chronic trauma. And chronic trauma is experiencing a repetitive experience, a distressed, or what did I say? Distressed or di- disturbing event in their life, but it's repetitive, like being in a abusive relationship, or witnessing abuse, or experiencing death, or experiencing rape over and over again, or molestation. These things, this is called a chronic trauma, but it's one event experiencing over and over and over. Where acute is just one event that just happened. You know, they could experience death, they could have went bankrupt, or they could have seen something that affected the individual, excuse me, mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Now, a more severe is called complex trauma. And inside of complex trauma, what's happening is the individual is suffering two or more events at the same time, two or more. And let's say, you know, a person is born into a war type situation, or they're born into poverty, or they're born into a violent situation, or some violence could have happened to them. Now, all four of those examples that I gave you could all happen to them at one time. They're experiencing two or more disturbing and distressing events in their life at one time. And it's sustained. It's sustained. Now, what happens after the individual experiences traumatic events in their lives, which affects them on four different levels: mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically, and it's manifested in the physical. This is the trauma is fertile grounds for the addiction. Now, what I like to do right at this point, you know, is just give a little breakdown of the four levels. And what I had mentioned in another one of my little commentaries, I broke down the mental, the physical, the spiritual, and emotional, which I'll do again. So let me dip down here and get my notes. And I'm back, and I'm going to give a definition of the four aspects, or the four makeups of the human being. Now, for simplicity, when I refer to the four levels: mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional, mental will mean a person's intelligence. And I'm not talking about, you know, how about measuring somebody's intelligence, you know, like how much intelligence they got as far as IQ and this type of stuff. So we're going to push that aside. On the mental aspect, we're talking about intelligence. On the physical aspect, I'm talking about the body, the person's physical body. And then on the spiritual aspect, I'm talking about energy. That's all I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a person's philosophical views, religious views, political views. I'm not referring to none of that. All I'm referring to on the spiritual side, excuse me, is energy. And then on the fourth one is emotion, or the emotional. Now, what I mean, what was translated in from emotional is, excuse me, is devotional. Is what is termed devotional, and we're going to see why this is termed, why I'm using these terms as far as the recovery sense is concerned. So it's mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. And so moving on, and let me check the health of my stream. And so moving on with this. So what happens is individual will suffer a certain amount of trauma. They'll suffer some trauma. And I just defined what trauma is. And it'll affect them in those four areas. And what will happen is the individual will start developing um, as a result of this trauma, which is pain, mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. A person would tend to medicate themselves. In other words, they'll do something to want to feel better, and a lot of times this will result in overeating. It could result in gambling. It could result in promiscuous sexual activity, drugs, alcohol. Um, I said overeating. They could be actually become workaholics. They can get into the to the work, want to work, and what it is their feelings and emotions. They're looking for something to compensate to make themselves feel better. As a result of now, they will develop obsessive and compulsive behavior. And in some circles, obsessive and compulsion or obsession and compulsion are the elements of the disease of addiction. So as a result of trauma, they'll move to obsessive and compulsive behavior, which is to treat the pain that they're feeling as a result of a traumatic event in their lives. Because like I said before, people just don't wake up in the morning and say, well, I guess I'll be an addict today. I guess I'll be a sex addict today, or I guess I'll just drink my life away, or use drugs until oblivion, or eat myself to death. A lot of it is a result of some trauma that's happened in their lives. Trauma is the breeding ground for addiction or for obsessive and compulsive behavior. That's exactly what it does. And addiction affects what? Feelings and emotions. And the symptoms is the drugs, is the alcohol, is the food. That's how it can be determined if a person has a what? An active addiction. As they could look at the symptoms. Just like just like the disease of addiction is just like the disease of addiction or is a disease. That's what they're calling addiction or alcoholism, a disease. The medical community has termed it as a disease. So there's symptoms. Just like there's symptoms for the common cold, and there's symptoms for HIV, and there's symptoms for diabetes, and there's symptoms for thyroid cancer. There's symptoms for just for every disease. So addiction has symptoms, and the symptoms is the use of what I just described: drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, games of chance, and it's and so what a person is trying to self medicate our feelings and emotions that's connected to a traumatic event. And as a result, the person's quality of life is affected. Um, if they were productive members of society, quote unquote, successful, and what and our term successful is anybody that's paying their own way through life. They paying their lights, their gas, their bills. They got maybe cars or bikes or what have you. They are pretty much self-supported um, individuals. So this being said, is this is called success. Now, mind you, there can be some people who um, can have, millions of dollars or hundreds and thousands of dollars, and they're able to maintain their themselves and use drugs and alcohol at the same time. But however, let me say, their quality of life is still would be affected by their use. At some point, they might have to have somebody come and step in and to main to help them maintain their finances. If not, take over their finances. They may have ended up in jails or some type of hospital or institution. Yeah, this could, no, this could happen with an individual. So moving on, we see the effects of the person's addiction inside the food. They're overweight. They probably 5 foot tall, or in my case, let's just say 6'1", 300 pounds. Or inside the sexual, promiscuous sexual, prostitution they might frequent prostitution, places of prostitution, or prostitutes, you know, to looking for a feel good. With the drugs and the alcohol, that's self-explanatory. So anyway, moving on, the symptoms are very much prevalent in their lives to it's lowering their quality of life. And it's very, very noticeable. Even if they're able to finance, you know, themselves. And we saw, with very famous people who's been worth like millions and millions of dollars, but as a result of their addiction, their quality of life was lower, or they just even died, or they got into contact with the law, and that, or went to rehabs. So these are telltale signs of people that have bouts with drug addiction. But if we look further into their lives, we can see that at some point there was some trauma, that they've experienced in their life. Yeah, and I won't go into anybody's names. I'm not gonna put no names out there, but we know. Sure, we know. We know who died in the past 10 years as a result of addiction, whether it was promiscuous sexual activity, drug addiction, overeating. And then another part of that overeating is binging and purging. Binging and purging. Eat food, you eat so much food, and then you regurgitate it. You throw it up again, or throw it up just to, I guess, maintain your weight, or whatever, maintain being slim or whatever. So rounding this thing up, about addiction, the symptoms, the trauma, which is there, which activates the addiction, or is a prime component from which addiction is born out of, to obsessive and compulsive behavior, where the person is treating their feelings and emotions with symptoms. So let's move on. I want to move on because, like I said, I had put a video out the other day and on this topic. So what I'm doing now is we're about to move on into the 12-step program. And how does a person get to the 12-step program as a result of what I just covered? Well, at some point, their lives become so unmanageable, and it's so obvious that they see it. See, a lot of times in the recovery process, a person, um, for whatever reason, would not, well, there are reasons. However, they will not accept that there's a problem going on and why they're doing what they're doing. So they will rationalize. And remember when I talked about intelligence, when I talked about the mental aspect, they will actually use their intellect to maintain what is called denial inside the recovery, inside inside the active addiction, because that's where at the level they're at. You know, when I was talking about, they're using different symptoms to treat their addiction, or to treat the feelings and emotions that's stemming from this trauma I was talking about, from the 3 levels of trauma. And so that being said, denial is the first barrier, or the main barrier that has to be penetrated before a person could come into 12-step recovery. Denial is the first hurdle that has to be penetrated before a person can step into active recovery. And so, and actually, to put the disease of addiction into remission, put their active addiction. And when I talk about active addiction, what I'm speaking on is the symptom, to get them to look at what this symptom is doing, because a lot of times, for most people that are in active addiction, they would tend to rationalize through their intelligence of why they're doing what they're doing. And it'll be anything to well, I'm not that bad, you know, and or such and such does this too, and look at me, I'm able to maintain a certain standard of living, and it goes on and on and on. And they will use the mental aspect to intellectualize what they're doing. And because at this point, I like to add that addiction does affect, the disease of addiction and alcoholism affects a person on all 4 levels: the mental, or the intelligence, the physical, or the body, the spiritual, or the energy, the emotion, or the devotional. Now, part of the part that the emotions plays in this in the scheme of this thing is that where the mental uses intelligence to maintain denial, on the emotional aspect, devotional, they're devoted. Remember, devotion or devoted. They're devoted to the active addiction, to maintain the active addiction. And their energy on the spiritual side, this is where they apply their energy, from their intelligence to their devotional, through the body. Spiritually, they're in some areas it's called being spiritual bankrupt. They use dark principles to maintain their addiction. When I say dark principles, I'm to maintain their addiction. Excuse me. To maintain their addiction, let's look at the obsessive and the compulsiveness. Inside the obsessive and compulsiveness of the disease of addiction, what's happening is the dark principles of dishonesty, deceitfulness, closed-mindedness, unwillingness, and their synonyms is what the individual uses to maintain their denial. So being spiritually bankrupt means that they're bankrupt on the, as far as being in the quote unquote light. The quote unquote light. They're living the dark side. And sometimes it's evident, it's very self evident, because a lot of us can see, we can actually see, an individual's aura. And it'll be said that, well, such and such, that person right there, seems like they're walking up under a dark cloud, right? And so, getting back to this hurdle I was talking about, which is the denial, and in one, and even though denial can be broken, there's different phases of denial, and I'll talk about extreme denial, which is one phase. Inside extreme denial, this is where the person refuses to see that their primary symptom is dominating their life. I mean, they can lose their job, they can go to jail, they can become homeless, penniless, but in their mind, there's always a rationale. Excuse me. There's always a rationale. Mentally, they have like blocks, a block in their mind, and they'll use their intelligence to justify the most outrageous nonsense and the reality of their lives, even though it's obvious, And then there's the other extreme, where the person will actually admit that something's wrong. They say, yeah, well, something wrong. Yeah, I lost my house. Yeah, I lost my job. Yeah, my significant other don't want anything to do with me, and so do the kids. But I'm not that bad. That's how it'll go. So moving on with this, at some point, we'll get to the part where the person will actually say, yeah, I have a problem. And this may come through what some people call a thorough ass whooping, that they see where their life is. I mean, not only do they see it, they're feeling it on all four levels. The pain of addiction, the pain of their, and when I say pain of addiction, I mean the pain of obsessive and compulsive behavior and where it has gotten them through the symptoms that they're using. They've lost all the money in the gambling house. They've contracted diseases and viruses or viruses. Or they're overeating, to the point where they're experiencing diabetes, high blood pressure, and the list goes on. So anyway, moving on, and all the way to their medical, they're talking about pre-existing conditions. They have a lot of conditions, health concerns. That's the word I'm looking for. So they have a lot of health concerns, and so that these things that I just mentioned is so extreme that some people say, man, I have to make a decision. Do I want to live or do I want to die? Do I want to live or do I want to die? And they get to the point where they want to live. Now, they might be in the hospital or they might meet a friend that might tell them about 12-step recovery. And see, I'm on it, and there's other ways a person can get healing, but I'm only talking about the 12-step perspective because this is my experience. This is my experience. And if y'all see, I'm playing with a crystal. Yeah, I'm in a little crystals right now. So anyway, so what happens is the denial is broken. Now here's the trick to it. A person can have relapse in denial. So anyway, let's just say the person's denial is broken and they're admitting that that their symptom is done beat them up. And understand this. A lot of people that suffer from addiction and alcoholism, they will admit to the symptom. And they will say, yeah, this symptom has really wrecked my life, traumatized their life. They will say that, yeah. And they will get, put their primary symptom down. They'll get clean. They'll stop eating, or they'll stop going to the casinos or the gambling houses or the boats or playing the numbers or whatever it is that they're doing. They might slow down on the, stop the promiscuous sexual relationships, right? Put the drinking down, put the drugging down, stop binging and purging. So they will stop as a result of their primary symptom. And they'll understand that this symptom has a control over their lives. Now, would this put them in recovery? That doesn't necessarily put them in recovery. What that does is when they stop the symptom is it sets the stage for recovery. A lot of people think that when they put the drugs down or when they put the food down that they're in recovery. And that's not true. There's another decision that has to be made that the individual has to make, and that's do they want to be in recovery or not? Because now what needs to be addressed is the deeper issue of what traumatized you. And that's where people will go into denial again. They'll go into denial again. They got to the point where they talk about, they'll about the symptoms. They'll talk about that symptom. They'll say, y'all gambled so much, I lost the house, I lost the car, I overate until I got medical bills. I'm 150 pounds over my weight, and as a result of that, I'm experiencing all types of health issues with the drinking, cirrhosis of the liver, and with the drugs and alcohol. Becoming addicted. They get clean, they stop all those things I just talked about. But now they got to look at the trauma if they want to recover. And that's why some people, they can put their primary symptom down, but when it comes to looking at the real reason why they were doing what they were doing, if the trauma is so great, they may not want to do that. They may not want to look at the rapes, the molestations. They may not at the violence that they grew up with. They may not want to look at the hunger. Certain things about their lives they may not want to look at. And this is when recovery, these are recovery-based issues. And a lot of times, as a result of a person where they came from, the environment where they came from, or how they was raised, there's certain things that they may not even want to look at. Yeah. Especially when you have mother-father relation, excuse me, when you have father and child relationships, when you've had family relationships, when you had relationships that was based on trust, that was supposed to have been based on trust, and they turned out to be abusive. That the people who you quote unquote thought should have loved you, they said something, but in their behavior, they did something else. Yeah. So a lot of times when people come into the rooms, people want to say, well, send them to the first step. I don't say send them to the first step. I said, let's sit down and have a talk. Let's talk about the program. Matter of fact, why don't you just spend some time just learning how to stay clean, or stop eating, or control your sexual behaviors or desires. Learn how to stop drinking first. Because when it gets to the point where we're going to talk about the recovery program and what it's going to ask of you, understand that what you're going to find out is that stop drinking or drugging or eating, that would have been real easy compared to about what you're about to face now. That's right. That's why people relapse after so many years, or some people don't even start working the program. Or some people, there are people who will come into the rooms, hear a few things that would trigger something inside them. They say, no, I ain't coming into this stuff right here. Yeah. But also at the same time, this is the same reason why people who come into 12-step recovery and follow the steps the way they're suggested, they grow mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. That's right. They grow in mentally, intellect, and that's not to say they're going to go to school, get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or a PhD, and that does happen. Or they're going to go to a school and, become a master trades person as far as plumbing and electronics and so forth. But that does happen. But on the intellectual part, coming from the recovery side, is very simple. That's the understanding of the 12-step principles, or the principles that's embodied in each of the 12 steps and of the 12 traditions of recovery. That a person can look at their own spirituality, their own energy. And I'm not, like referring to like religion, or different other philosophies like Hinduism or Buddhism, uh, the meditative philosophies. I'm not talking about that. No, I'm just talking about just plain simple energy. And there's a reason why I'm talking about energy, which I'll go into later. Because, and I'm just going to give, put a little piece of it out right here, is because energy is something, it can neither be created nor destroyed, but it's something that we all, or every living thing has. So anyway, moving on. I need to take a little taste of my tea right here. So moving on, but let's say, for example, a person they they make the decision to put the symptom down. They do get to the point where they're working through their denial and they're coming into reality, and they make a decision to put their primary symptoms down, and they make the decision to say, okay, I'm gonna get better, and I'm gonna work these steps. I'm a practice honesty. I'm a practice open mindedness. I'm a practice willingness because I know this program could work for me like it worked for hundreds and thousands of other people. They get to that point. So so that being said, they're they're in, they're introduced to the honesty, the open mindedness, and the willingness of the program. The attitude of intolerance and indifference has been they've overcome to a certain point. And then they're ready to look at the first step. And then inside the first step, it says, uh, we admitted that we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. And then if you're doing the AA program, we admitted that we were uh, powerless over our alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. So, so when through that admission, what they're actually talking about is not only the symptom, they're about to go into the obsessive and the compulsive behavior, and then they are also about to look at some of the trauma. And that's through through each step, though. See the 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 condition. I mean not the condition for recovery was actually um, placed into effect when the person started working on their denial, looking at their obsessive compulsive behavior, looking at their symptoms, surrendering to their symptoms, but also being ready to. They've addressed that trauma, but not on a deep level yet. They've addressed the trauma of their symptoms, what the symptoms was playing in their lives. They hadn't got to the point where I ain't gonna say they hadn't got to because everybody's different. But yeah, they've actually got to the point where um, where they've on the surface. That's what it's called. So they're doing a little surface recovery. They staying clean. They off their symptoms. They might even talk about how the symptoms um, affect their life and traumatize their life, really. Because remember, when you're dealing with those symptoms that I talked about, getting and using, you're actually you're actually talking about levels of trauma then. And some people call that like the tip of the iceberg because or surface recovery, when you're talking about your symptoms. However, to get to um, a more to get to below the surface and start working towards the core, we start looking at what the trauma is. So inside the first step, it talks about the powerlessness, not so much of the drugs and the alcohol, but also the trauma that the drugs and the alcohol created in the individual's life. As you start moving towards from surface recovery to subsurface recovery, now you about ready to look at some you getting ready to look at the trauma. Now inside the second step, it says we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, right? And remember when I talked about the mental aspect of the disease of addiction, and I equated it with the inter with the inter excuse me. I equated it with the intellect. Well, a power greater than oneself could be the intellect, but it also could be the physical aspect. But it could also be the spiritual aspect or the emotional aspect or any combination of those four. Because we're talking about a power greater than ourselves. And when I say we, I mean mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. And a power greater than ourselves is whatever it is that changes your mind in the moment when the obsessive and the compulsive behavior is activated. And it could be activated from anywhere from mild forms of trauma to extreme forms of trauma. And it could be acute trauma. It could be, some that a single thing that takes you back to that thought of that person, place, or that thing in the most underlying trauma. Yeah, that's right. So, moving on with this, inside the second step, it talks about a power greater than selves, but understand that alcoholism or drug addiction or overeating is a power greater than the individual. If it wasn't, how through your own primary how through your own primary symptom did you get to where you were, or even where you at now? If you're in some type of rehab or some jail or prison, or you into even in the program, as a result of none of that, you just came to the program one day as a result of your own behavior. So moving on, and that being said, inside the second step is showing you the insanity that was nurtured, number one, through obsessive and compulsive behavior, that came about through a traumatizing event. And that lets you know that what? Trauma is a power greater than the individual, right? Sure it is. And then you're looking at 3 levels of trauma. So there's 3 more powers greater than the individual. But then, I could turn around and I could say love, faith, service to other, charity, hope, compassion, patience, tolerance, honesty, open-mindedness, willingness, being empathetic. Those are powers greater than themselves too. So what the second step is actually doing is making the individual conscious of there's certain things around you that's greater than you, or going on within you and around you that's bigger than you. From the act of addiction to recovery, to the principles, values, and morals that the individual lives. That's what step 2 is saying. However, the key ingredient is remaining open, keeping what? Your mind open, because what did I say before? On the mental aspect, on the mental aspect, or the intelligence, that would be the thing that would close the individual's mind through its own rationale. Through its own rationale. Right. And so this is where a lot of people coming into recovery, as they get to certain phases inside the recovery process, they will actually if not careful, relapse. And they think that a lot of times that relapse is just an accident. I hear people, I fell off the wagon, or I tripped and fell and stuff like that. It's like, no, you did not trip. You didn't fall off. You might have jumped off, but you didn't fall, Chief. So I'm going to do step 3. And then I'm going to stop it. And then on my next video, we'll pick it up. We'll pick that up. So looking at coming from trauma, or one of the 3 phases of trauma: acute, chronic, and complex. Starting right there, going to the obsessive and compulsive behavior, using the denial to support the way a person lives, from the obsessive and compulsive behavior, then activating, their use of whatever behavior they have to a combination of behavior. This is what the individual is actually using to defend their symptom, or having the symptom, and then using certain principles to defend their what they're using, right? So this is what's going on. Now, because addiction is so cunning and baffling and powerful, and it's something that a person can't do by themselves. So what they would need is some assistance to help them with their energy. And then that's called, some people call it a higher power, some people call it God. And then, if you're an atheist or agnostic, excuse me, if you're atheist, and it's like about 2:30, it's like what, going on 2:30 in the morning, and I started like, 45 minutes ago? I started almost an hour ago. So anyway, I'm gonna start wrapping this piece up right here, and I'm just gonna cover the first 3 steps. So anyway, a person has to make a decision to turn their will and their lives over to the care of God. And when I say lives, I mean mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. And turning over to God doesn't mean that I'm just going to abandon my whole life and give it to this God type thing. It don't mean that. What it means is, when you say turn it over to the care of God, simply something good. Now, I know a lot of us out there, we very adamant about our religious belief, right? But understand this. See, this is what I understand. That an individual, their religious life was their symptom, their service to their symptom. And now that a person get clean, out of guilt or anger, they may start claiming like the God. And they'll go straight into a dogma type thing. And when I say dogma, I'm talking about anywhere from dogma. We read in different types of philosophy that ain't never helped you in the first place, and I'm gonna put that out there. But because, like a lot of times, individuals, they get clean, and then they got this newfound whatever it is. And basically what it is, they learn how to stop using, and then they blame everything on God. But really, the recovery process is not over, because when you make the decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of God, you're going to do something that's very hard for most addicts, and that's to learn this program and live it. And when I say learn the programs, learn the spiritual principles of the program, learn how to put them into your life and live it. Because what has happened, remember I talked about the dark principles earlier? And what I understand, that a lot of people in the addictive process, man, they put not only them through some hell, they put the people around them through the same type of hell too. You know. So anyway, winding down. Yeah, winding down. Because I don't want to go over in an hour with this. So winding down, we had step 3, and we went from the trauma to obsessive and compulsive behavior, which bred resentment, anger, fear, and rage, feelings and emotions. This is where the recovery process begins. We also talked about feelings. Excuse me. We also talked about symptoms. Yeah, we talked about symptoms. And how the symptoms is a real manifestation of what? Of the trauma, the obsessive compulsive behavior, and also is connected to the resentment, anger, and fear. Because as a result of the usage and the trauma and everything in the middle of them, this is where the person became the addict at. Well, I ain't gonna say became. They use addictive principles, which is dark principles, to see their way through their day-to-day life. So inside the first 3 steps is laid the foundation for recovery. Come and recover from whatever the traumatizing event was, in which we're about to go into that, from step 4 all the way to step 9. So we did the first 3 steps. So anyway, I'm about to wrap this up. I'd like to say thank everybody for your participation. I got, like I said, I got some more videos out. Suni, Suni, Sami, Sami, AANA principles. Hit that on the YouTube. I'm gonna be doing some stuff on Twitter. Eventually, I'll be working on my sleepy. What am I trying to say? I'll be working on the podcast. But first, I'm working, I'm following some suggestions. I have a mentor, and the suggestion is put out 30 videos. That's what I was told. Put 30 videos out on YouTube, and I understand why. Because when I look at myself and I start critiquing myself, I was like, man, you yeah, everything from my vocabulary to my demeanor, but my intentions is good, and we're gonna get this thing together. So continue to support me. Take everything a day at a time. My next 2 steps is gonna be 4 and 5 for sure, and I'm looking at doing it later on today. It's Tuesday morning. It's about 2:30, and I've talked for. It's gonna be 1 hour and about 38 minutes. So anyway, the topic is in AA, NA commentary on 12-step recovery, understanding trauma, a perspective from Suni Sami. And I'd like to thank everybody. How did y'all like my show today? What? It was funny. What about the people to the left? Yeah, yeah. I'd like to thank y'all. And guess what? We're about to sign off, and this is the music that I'm using. Oh, that was not the music. All right, Detroit, I'll be coming there soon. See my mother, my brother, my daughters, and the others. I thank y'all for letting me share.